Ready to go? Well, hello and welcome to Meeting Jesus in the Gospel of Mark, and it's session 13, Mark chapter 8, verses 1 through 34. This is being recorded on January the 25th, 2022, and a very special greeting to all of the people who are joining us online, because due to current pandemic restrictions, nobody's allowed to be here. So it's an unusual session for us tonight, but for those of you who've been following us online, again, send your questions through to Melissa on our YouTube comments, and then she'll pass them on to me. As far as next week goes with our Bible study session, check our website and our Facebook page to see whether or not we're able to welcome people back into the building for the study. But with no further ado, then, let's continue on in the Gospel of Mark as we meet Jesus together in Mark chapter 8, verses 1 through 34. The Gospel tells us, during those days, another large crowd gathered. Since they had nothing to eat, Jesus called his disciples to him and said, "I have compassion for these people. They've already been with me 3 days and have nothing to eat. If I send them home hungry, they'll collapse on the way, because some of them have come a long distance." Well, here we go again. This story of the feeding of the 4,000 sounds an awful lot like the feeding of the 5,000 that we read about in chapter 6. And there are so many common elements in the story, which differs only in the details, it's tempting to write it off as just a retelling of the earlier event. But Mark is very well aware of the similarities, and Jesus speaks of and compares both events just a little bit later in the gospel. So it must be a separate event and not just a retelling of the same thing from a different angle or a different perspective. There's some things to notice when you're going through this. First of all, it starts with "during those days." And that ties that story together with the healing of the deaf and mute man at the end of chapter 7, which incidentally we didn't cover last week because we ran out of time, but it's there at the end of chapter 7. And that seems to place Jesus in the Gentile area that he was there in chapter 5. Remember the man who had the legion of demons? That was in the Decapolis area as well, on the eastern side of the Sea of Galilee. And so if this story says during those days, that ties it together with the healing of the deaf and mute man at the end of chapter 7. So it places Jesus and it places this feeding in the Gentile area called the Decapolis. Now that location is important. So keep that in mind. So what's been going on? Well, if you remember back to last week in chapter 7, that highlighted the conflicts with the Pharisees about properly maintaining strict Jewish law. There was that whole dispute regarding why do your disciples not wash their hands properly and wash their dishes and so on before they eat? And we went through a lengthy discussion of kosher laws, and the Pharisees were upset with Jesus for not following those. But that conflict with the very high end of Jewish observance of the law was followed by the account with the dangerously foreign Syrophoenician woman, and then the healing of the deaf-mute man in the Decapolis, and now the feeding of the Gentile 4,000. So you've got this conflict with the Pharisees, these keepers of Jewish tradition and law, followed by an account with a Syrophoenician foreign woman, an account of a healing of a deaf-mute man in the Decapolis, again, non-Jew, and now all of the messianic blessings are being offered to the Jews, like the feeding of the 5,000, are now being shared with the Gentiles. And that's important because that's a sign that the Messiah and the kingdom of God is not just for the Jewish people, but it's for all people. Jesus has come for all the world, Jews and Gentiles. Now, we may think, it's quite natural for us to think, largely being Gentiles, that it's only fair that we get a share in Christ's benefits. But from Mark's Jewish perspective, the inclusion, the admission of the Gentiles is a sign of the coming kingdom of God, one of the most important signs of the coming kingdom of God. Now, the miracle here signifies that Jesus is not just a Redeemer, a Messiah like Moses and David, but he's the Redeemer, offering redemption to more than just the people of Israel. But Jesus' ministry will go far beyond that to embrace all of humanity. This feeding of the 4,000 is part of that story being told. So it introduces the crowd as being another large crowd. Now that tells us that Jesus has been attracting many such crowds. In fact, we hear of groups of people where the numbers are so great that Jesus and the disciples have to stand in a boat offshore just to make sure they're not crushed by the numbers. But this one is remarkable in size, much like the feeding of the 5,000 crowd. Well, this, however, as opposed to that 5,000 group, this is a particularly dedicated gang because they're there for several days, we hear, and they have long since run out of food. Jesus seems to be spending significant time in the area of the Decapolis. And so it's not just that they have run from Capernaum to Tabgha or Bethsaida to Tabgha. In this case, they have been with Jesus for days. And once again, Jesus responds with compassion. We hear that some have come from a long distance. Oh, no, we have a question coming from you, yes.
Would this be a very normal thing for crowds of 4,000 or 5,000?
So the question is it normal for groups of 4,000 or 5,000 people to follow a Messiah figure? Normal is maybe strong. In fact, it was considered so unusual that if you look at many older Bible commentaries, they will say, oh, well, these numbers are inflated by at least a factor of 10, because there weren't even that many people living in Galilee at the time. Even if you gathered every man, woman, and child in Galilee and brought them together, you wouldn't come up with 5,000 people. Well, we since know that Capernaum and Magdala together probably had a population of about 15,000. As more and more archaeology happens, we realize how many more people are there. But bringing those kinds of crowds in, there was a rebellion in this area of Galilee around the time of Jesus' birth. And that rebellion attracted very, very large crowds and was put down very, very strongly by the military authorities. So there was a reticence to have large crowds gather like this. So this would have been very, very unusual and would have been part of the panic that was being felt by the religious authorities. So we've heard elsewhere how Jesus is attracting crowds not just from the immediate area, but from far afield. Remember that he was known to the Syrophoenician woman because they were people who were being attracted to Jesus' ministry from all the way from there. Now, if this story is taking place in the Decapolis to the west of this should actually say to the east of the Sea of Galilee. I'm sorry, you'll have to correct that in your notes. That would encompass parts of what we now know as Syria and Jordan, where we know that Christian communities were established very, very early on. Now, his disciples answered, where Jesus says we have to feed these people, the disciples answer, where in this remote place can anyone get enough bread to feed them? Well, how many loaves do you have? Jesus asked. 7, they replied. He told the crowd to sit down on the ground, and when he had taken the 7 loaves and given thanks, he broke them and gave them to his disciples to distribute to the people, and they did so. They had a few small fish as well, and he gave thanks for them also and told the disciples to distribute them. And the people ate, and they were satisfied. And afterward, the disciples picked up 7 basketfuls of broken pieces that were left over, and about 4,000 were present. Now, if you remember at all the feeding of the 5,000 from chapter 6, you're thinking, boy, this is sounding awfully familiar. And it is. If you compare the feedings, you'll find that both occur in a desert place, that the plight of each crowd spurs Jesus' compassion. Both feedings feature an exchange between Jesus and the disciples about the logistics of feeding such a number. In the first feeding, the disciples worry over the great expense of buying bread for such a crowd. In the second, they say, look, there's not even any place nearby for the crowd to buy bread for themselves. Jesus asks the disciples how much they have. It's not enough even for themselves. In both incidents, Jesus asks God for what they managed to scrounge, thanks God for what they managed to scrounge together, and he has the disciples distribute it to the seated multitude. We're not told about groups of 50 or 100 in this instance, but they are seated. Miraculously, the crowd eats its fill. The disciples collect an abundance of leftovers. In the second feeding, the number fed drops from 5,000 to 4,000. The loaves and fishes increase from 5 loaves and 2 fish to 7 loaves and some small fish. And the number of baskets of fragments left over diminishes from 12 to 7. So lots of similarities, but some numerical differences too. A question from the crowd. Lloyd was wondering, why are these people not at work? This was a big deal. This was a big deal. The kind of work that most people were doing back then was not, factory work or things like that where you punched a time clock. Most people were either self-employed as fishermen or working as day laborers or were smallhold farmers or pig keepers, as we saw in the Decapolis as well. A lot of these people set their own times, set their own clocks, and I'm sure some of them who would have been expected to show up at work, maybe in a vineyard or a threshing floor, didn't show up because they were having this once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to get in on something big. So, why weren't they all at work? I've never thought of that question before. Thanks, Lloyd. I'm sure there's more people. There was the occasional landowner or vineyard owner standing wondering exactly that same question. Where are all of my hired hands? So we've got these changes in the number, 5,000 to 4,000, 5 loaves and 2 fish to 7, and a few small fish, and baskets left over diminishes from 12 to 7. Is that significant? Well, while it's not explicitly stated, we can make some assumptions here. That 5,000 in the Jewish area, 4,000 in the Gentile. That could demonstrate that Jesus' popularity in those days was still greater among the Jews, but still very substantial among the Gentiles. Now, the 12 versus 7 baskets of leftovers, that's a little more interesting. That could be a confirmation that the first feeding was indeed to a Jewish crowd, 12 baskets representing the 12 tribes, while the second mirrors the 7 days of creation. 7, you hear the number 7, you're thinking of the days of creation. So is it possible that that number 7 indicates that this is for all the world? It's a blessing for all of created humanity. The text isn't explicit about that, but I think those are pretty good guesses. So our reading continues. After he'd sent them away, Jesus got into the boat with his disciples and went to the region of Dalmanutha. And the Pharisees came, and they began to question Jesus. And to test him, they asked him for a sign from heaven. And he sighed deeply and said, "Why does this generation ask for a sign? Truly, I tell you, no sign will be given to it." And then he left them, got back into the boat, crossed to the other side. So, the feeding of the 4,000 on the eastern shore of the Sea of Galilee. Now it's a quick trip back in the boat to the Jewish area of Dalmanutha. And that is a name that is lost to the current area around the Sea of Galilee, but it's now presumed to be in the area of Magdala on the northwest side of the lake. I've really gotten my west and east mixed up. You know how bad I am at identifying left and right on the various screens. I've obviously had trouble in assembling this as well. So Magdala is on the northwest side of the lake. Now, right away, the Pharisees again find Jesus and go on the offensive. They ask for a sign from heaven. Now, they have seen healings. They've seen other miracles. We know that they were present with Jesus for some of these. But now they want unmistakable proof, a sign from heaven that Jesus is not just a miracle worker, but the Messiah. What might that sign be? We read that Jesus sighed deeply. That always, to me, I can just sort of see Jesus go, maybe even slap the forehead. Disappointment, frustration, exasperation. After all that has happened, the Pharisees are still wanting Jesus to pass a test. That's important language, because the last time such language was used was in the wilderness, when Jesus was being tempted. Actually, the word is tested by Satan. Now, Jesus passed that test, but he's unwilling to provide incontrovertible proof of his messiahship to the Pharisees, which would leave no room for faith. Move this mountain or cause this earthquake or slaughter this group of Romans over here. The Pharisees would have been happy with any of those. But in this same chapter, Peter will make this messianic identification, which the Pharisees were unable to do. It's no coincidence that the Pharisees are saying, we're not going to believe you unless. But Peter, just in the very next section, is going to identify Jesus for who Jesus is. He can see things that the Pharisees cannot yet see. Now, that said, the disciples still aren't really getting it. We read in Mark 8:14-21, the disciples had forgotten to bring bread, except for one loaf they had with them in the boat. Be careful, Jesus warned them. Watch out for the yeast of the Pharisees and that of Herod. They discussed this with one another and said, it's because we have no bread. Now, aware of their discussion, Jesus asked them, why are you talking about having no bread? Do you still not see or understand? Are your hearts hardened? Do you have eyes but fail to see and ears but fail to hear? And don't you remember? When I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000, how many basketfuls of pieces did you pick up? 12, they replied. And when I broke the 7 loaves for the 4,000, how many basketfuls of pieces did you pick up? They answered, 7. He said to them, do you still not understand? Well, we just had Jesus sighing deeply in his encounter with the Pharisees, and I was really frustrated with the disciples. And his frustration with the Pharisees is now really going to come out against the disciples. They too seem blind to what all these signs are pointing to. And Jesus warns them about their lack of faith and their constant need for more and more proof, which they share with the Herodians and the Pharisees. And he compares it to leaven. Or yeast, it says in many translations. The better translation is leaven, which is a fermentation agent which feeds on the nutrients but has no substance or structure of its own. It's basically a foam suspension of the gas produced by the yeast. Now, Jesus really boils over himself here like leaven. He says to the disciples, and this is great, do you still not see or understand? Are your hearts hardened? Do you have eyes but fail to see and ears but fail to hear? And don't you remember? Do you still not understand? It's an amazing section of verses. And you can just imagine the disciples shrinking back and shrinking back and shrinking back as Jesus' frustration really comes to a point here. Why? Because even after feeding 9,000 people, the 5,000, the 4,000, with baskets left over, the disciples are concerned that they only brought 1 loaf with them. What are they going to eat? They're concerned that Jesus cannot meet their needs, that they will be left wanting. It's the classic what about me question. And Jesus is wondering, how can you believe that I would let you down? The story continues in Mark chapter 8. They came to Bethsaida, and some people brought a blind man, and they begged Jesus to touch him. He took the blind man by the hand and led him outside the village. And when he'd spit on the man's eyes and put his hands on him, Jesus asked, do you see anything? He looked up and said, I see people. They look like trees walking around. And once more, Jesus put his hands on the man's eyes, and then his eyes were opened, his sight was restored, and he saw everything clearly. And Jesus sent him home, saying, don't even go into the village. There's lots of interesting things here. You see, having left the Pharisees and the crowds behind, they parked the boat at Bethsaida, where the Jordan River meets the lake, en route to the north. They're once again trying to get away from the crowds. Jesus needs some private moments with the disciples. So this time, they're going to head north. They've tried heading east. They attract a crowd of 4,000. They tried heading west into Syrophoenicia. They attract people there as well. Now they're going to go due north. This is what the map looks like now. I can readily identify north and south better than I can east and west, obviously, because they're going to go to Bethsaida. Now, where is Bethsaida? Now, this is something that we think would be fairly obvious, but there's actually an ongoing archaeological debate as to which Bethsaida is being talked about, because there are ruins in 2 places that are both very, very possible. One is Bethsaida Julius, which is somewhat north of the entrance to the Sea of Galilee. And the other is called Bethsaida, Galilee, which is more or less right at the point at which the Jordan River comes into the top of the Sea of Galilee and feeds the Sea of Galilee. Now, why is there any question whatsoever? You'd think this would be fairly obvious. Well, it's because about 400 years before Jesus was born, there was a massive earthquake and landslide in the area. We forget the fact, or many people don't even realize that the Jordan Valley is actually the Jordan Rift, and it's a meeting of some very large tectonic plates which shift as much as 100 meters during a massive earthquake. It's also a volcanic zone. And so several hundred years before Jesus, a very major city called Bethsaida in the north was utterly destroyed with a big landslide. And so archaeology is still uncertain to point out which one. But it's at the northern point of the Sea of Galilee. We have a question from the floor.
Mona has a comment. It seems no matter what Jesus does, the Pharisees are still blind or unwilling to see him for who he is.
Yeah.
It seems the apostles have the same problem.
Yes, the comment that came from the floor is that or from the internet is that the disciples and the Pharisees seem to have the same problem in not being able to recognize Jesus for who he is, despite what he does. And Jesus is certainly frustrated by that as well. So there's Jesus and the disciples. They park the boat in Bethsaida. And folks there know of Jesus because Bethsaida is the hometown of three of the apostles, Peter and Andrew and Philip. And the townsfolk bring him a blind man. They know that Jesus' reputation for healing is strong. Now, something very interesting happens. In order to respect the man as a human being, and not as a healing spectacle to cause yet another scene, we're told that Jesus takes the man outside the village. Now notice also it says village, okay? It doesn't say city or town. So we know that by this time Bethsaida is a small place. Capernaum would have been called either a town or a city. What does Jesus do once he's outside of the realm of the city or the town, the village? He uses saliva as a healing mechanism. We've heard Jesus do this before. Now, in sharing of his own physical substance with the man, with his saliva, is Jesus indicating that there's inherent power in himself as the new Adam, bringing physical restoration to creation? In any case, surprisingly, the healing is incomplete, and Jesus has to do it again because it wasn't a total healing the first time. This time the cure is total. Now, what's going on here? Many years ago, I had a friend of mine who was a big Johnny Cash fan. And Johnny Cash very famously made several trips to Israel. Johnny Cash was a committed Christian, and these trips to Israel were very important for him. And he wrote all kinds of gospel songs while in Israel. And one of the songs really stuck in my mind and plays in a loop in my head. It's the great song, I'm sure you know it, I See Men as Trees Walking. I'd sing it for you now, but I forgot my guitar, so we missed a great opportunity there to hear my Johnny Cash impersonation. But in any case, the man could see, but the people looked like trees walking, he says. And so then Jesus performs the healing again, and this time the cure is total. Now, why wasn't Jesus able to fully heal this man the first time around? That's something that we're not used to hearing at all. We're used to these miraculous, instantaneous healing. A paralyzed fellow is lowered through the roof, and Jesus heals him. The man stands up, bounces to his feet, picks up his mat, goes home. This guy can't see clearly after the first healing. So why are there two stages of healing? Well, my favorite explanation is that the first stage of healing was physical. The man's eyes were indeed restored and now fully functioning. Eye, optic nerve, all the rest of it. But the second stage was the healing of the man's ability to interpret what he's now finally able to see. It's sort of a philosophical question. If you've never seen before, when suddenly you can see, how do you interpret that? How do you figure that out? I don't know if you've seen these little videos on YouTube and social media where somebody has an ear implant and they're able to hear for the first time. Or a baby who could never see clearly is given these special glasses, and all of a sudden the baby can see, and you can see their face light up. And you wonder how long it's going to take them to figure out how to process that enormous amount of information that we take for granted. So is that what's happening? That the man was physically cured, but still needed this second touch of Jesus to enable him to now begin to interpret what he's able to see. Not men as trees walking, but men as men, things as they actually are. Now, is this an illustration of what's about to happen with the disciples? That they have seen Jesus and what he can do, but now they're about to properly identify the truth of who Jesus is. They've seen him, but they haven't interpreted him correctly. But they're about to. So with this illustration in your mind, let's walk with the disciples all the way up. And boy, this is a walk. This is a good hour and a half or 2 hours by bus. All the way to the villages around Caesarea Philippi. And on the way, he asked them, "Who do people say I am?" They replied, "Some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, still others, one of the prophets." "What about you?" he asked. "Who do you say I am?" And Peter answered, "You're the Messiah." And Jesus warned them not to tell anyone about him. This is a very important passage in the gospel, because now they've escaped Bethsaida without drawing a crowd, which is likely why Jesus asked the now seeing man to not return to the village but go straight home. Very practical reason for telling the man not to tell anybody, because Jesus and the disciples simply needed to get away without 900 people following them everywhere. Now it appears as though Jesus and the disciples are finally going to get away from it all. To do so, they pick what would be for a group of Jews a very odd choice. Caesarea Philippi, a center of pagan religious pilgrimage and worship. So what is Caesarea Philippi? Well, it's located in the very north of modern Israel. I'll show you a map and pictures in a moment. And in Jesus' day, it was in the Tetrarchy of Philip, and it was named in honor of the emperor. And Caesarea Philippi is an impressive rock face. It's featuring a large, deep cave, very, very large, deep cave from which arose springs. The whole area has springs coming up from it, which were a primary source and are a primary source for the Jordan to this day. There are three main sources for the Jordan River. There's the Caesarea Philippi, which is known today as Dan, or Panias, I should say. And then there are the springs, which come from Dan, which is just to the west of Caesarea Philippi, and then the river known as the Schneer, all feed the Jordan River. So there's a lot of water coming out here, bubbling up from the ground, and bubbling up in this cave as well. And sacrifices would be made and thrown into the cave to be accepted or not by the various pagan gods. Now, there was a large temple to the god Pan. That's the goat, half man guy with his flute. And that was in front of the cave. And that cave was actually known as the gateway to hell. And there was a shrine to Pan's father Hermes immediately to the right, and a temple to the emperor as the Son of God was placed on the left. Many other niches and temples were scattered across the vast rock face, representing all of the known pagan gods. So how far north is it? Well, you can see it's quite a bit north, even on this map. You have to go way north through the Hula Valley, it's called, and along the Golan Heights all the way up into Caesarea Philippi. One of the great moments when you're passing up the Hula Valley, up through that area just to the east of or to the west of the Jordan River, there I go again. You pass one of the great bird sanctuaries in all the world. It's kind of a stopping place for these vast flocks of birds which are flying between Africa and Europe. And Canadian Tourists and pilgrims are always astonished to see the great big sign on the entrance to this massive bird sanctuary, which is known as the Stephen Harper Bird Sanctuary, named in honor of the former Canadian Prime Minister, who was regarded to have been a great fan of Israel. I always have the bus driver beep the horn when we see the sign, and inevitably a flock of birds go up, and all the liberals on the bus get angry. So that's Caesarea Philippi to the north. This is what it looks like today, and you can see these springs of water coming and flowing out from that area towards the Jordan River, and you can see that massive cave mouth, which is a very, very dramatic thing. For those of you who have very good screens, you'll be able to see very small people standing in front of that cave, which is quite massive. Now, that's what it looks like today, this impenetrable cliff face with water coming out. If you would have been there in Jesus' day, you would have seen something very, very different. There was this massive temple of Pan on the left side of the screen, right in front of that cave mouth, and you can see the various niches in the wall and so on, which are still there today. There was a temple to Hermes. There were temples to all the known gods. And just out of the range of this particular image is a temple to the so-called son of God, Caesar Augustus, the Roman emperor. So you could go to Caesarea Philippi and worship not only the emperor, but all the known gods and make sacrifices to all the known pagan gods at the time. Sort of a one-stop Disneyland of ancient pagan religion. So there's a very neat comparative picture here, a computer thing. And you can see looking down those little lines in front of the cave, those are people, just to give you an idea of the size of the thing. And now they've superimposed a computer graphic over it to show you how those temples were placed there. So you go back and you can see the foundations of the temples have been excavated, and this is what it would have looked like back then. Very, very impressive. Now, the other Gospels tell a far more complete story of this, but Mark zeroes in on Peter's words, "You are the Messiah." Now, incidentally, this is what a wider view of Caesarea Philippi would have looked like. We always get the idea when we go there that the only thing that was there were these temples and then there was nothing. But it's simply the fact that the archaeology hasn't proceeded to excavate much, much further along into what was a very, very large city at the time. So imagine Jesus and the disciples in this incredibly pagan area, center of pagan worship of all the pagan gods. This is where they go to get away from it all. Now, Matthew and Luke place Jesus' question to the disciples, "Who do you say that I am?" right at this very spot, whereas Mark places it on the way, and the disciples have time to think. So Jesus says, "Who do people say that I am?" Now, interestingly, if you have a really good memory, you might remember in chapter 6, the very same answer having been given. The disciples give the very same response as the crowds and Herod back in chapter 6. Who do people say that I am? Well, people, it says, Mark says, thought that Jesus was Elijah or one of the prophets, maybe even, as Herod feared, John the Baptist come back from the dead. So that's repeated twice, just about word for word between chapter 6 and 8. So those are apparently the real representative opinions during Jesus' ministry as to who he might in fact be. Perhaps even after the ministry of Jesus. People say, who was that guy? Oh, maybe it's John the Baptist come back to life. Maybe it's Elijah come back to life. Maybe it's one of the prophets, like Elisha. But any of these identifications could account for Jesus' ability to work miracles. But the upcoming transfiguration, which we're going to be coming up to soon, will leave no doubt in anybody's mind. So Jesus wants to narrow that question down. What do people say that I am? But what about you, he asked. Who do you say that I am? Now, it's no coincidence that this question is asked at the exact midpoint of the Gospel of Mark. Chapters 1 to 8a, just a little bit into chapter 8, have been establishing Jesus' identity as the Messiah through miracles and the events on the Sea of Galilee, the feeding of the 5,000, and all the rest of it. He's very clearly the Messiah. But now we're going to transition, this fulcrum of the gospel. Peter says, you're the Messiah. Okay, now you realize that. Now the rest of the gospel is going to explain the consequences of that identity, a new understanding of what Messiah means. It's very interesting that in your Bibles, if you go to the beginning of the Gospel of Mark, all the way to the end of the Gospel of Mark, just go through the pages and go to the page right in the middle, and here you're going to have Peter's confession. What about you? Who do you say that I am? And Peter answered, you are the Messiah. So there it is. In the very same chapter where the Pharisees demand yet a further unmistakable sign, the very same chapter where Jesus is exasperated at the disciples' inability to truly see who he is, despite all the miracles, the same chapter where a blind man is healed but still cannot somehow fully immediately understand what he sees, finally, Peter sees clearly. You see how Mark was building up to this moment of revelation from Peter. A question. The question is Peter's understanding of the Messiah anywhere near Jesus' understanding of Messiah? Well, let me tell you. Jesus warned them, as soon as Peter says, you're the Messiah, Jesus says, don't tell anybody. No. This is baffling. They finally get it, and the first thing Jesus says is be quiet. Why keep it a secret? Is it because they're in the epicenter of pagan worship and Jesus would be proclaimed as just another god? Or perhaps dangerously proclaiming himself as a rival to Caesar as the Son of God, a capital offense, and ending the ministry of Jesus then and there? It's like somebody saying, no, I'm actually the president. Oh, wait, that's been done. So far, no jail. I don't understand. In any case, is this why Jesus says don't tell anybody? Or, and I think this is the better reason, another compelling reason for silence is that while the disciples now see Jesus as the Messiah, they do not understand what this means. And Jesus is about to completely overturn and redefine their expectations to Peter's dismay. What's Peter expecting? He's expecting Jesus to now lead the revolution, jump on a horse, grab a sword, slaughter the bad guys, get an army together, kick the Romans out, right? That's not what's going to happen, as we know, but as Peter did not yet understand. And here we're told. Jesus then began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the teachers of the law, and that he must be killed, and after 3 days rise again. He spoke plainly about this. And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But when Jesus turned and looked at his disciples, he rebuked Peter. Get behind me, Satan, he said. You do not have in mind the concerns of God, but merely human concerns. You're not thinking like God thinks. You're thinking like people think. What do people think when the Messiah comes? He's going to be brandishing a sword, riding a white charger, expelling the Romans, restoring Israel to geopolitical power. But Jesus instead presents an Isaiah-style suffering servant Messiah who will carry upon himself the punishment of the people and die on their behalf. Well, that's all too much for Peter. That's too big of a reversal to take. And, have a little bit of sympathy and understanding for Peter. The guys who are following Jesus, like Peter, have staked their lives on him. And he's now predicting what appears to be utter failure. They've hitched their wagon to Jesus' cart, and Jesus is saying, okay, here we go over the cliff. That's not what they had in mind. They thought they were following the Messiah who would proclaim himself king of all and take over the world, and they would be right there by his side. But the plan is going to work out somewhat differently, as we know, as they did not. And so Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. That's a strong word. It's used in Jesus' interactions with evil spirits. When an evil spirit is saying, "You're the Messiah, you're Messiah," Jesus rebukes them. And here, Peter rebukes Jesus. This is strong language. This isn't, "Yeah, Jesus, I don't know, maybe you want to package this information a little bit differently. This is not the expectation we had." No, Peter is rebuking Jesus. No way. No, this is a bad idea. Don't even say it. Don't even think it. Don't even speak it again. Don't you do that. No. Now, he took Jesus aside to do that. But in contrast, Jesus then rebukes Peter in front of them all. And the gospel makes a point of saying Jesus rebuked Peter in front of them all, saying that there's a plan of God which far outweighs their human concerns and their very human expectations. Now, again, we know the whole story. And so for us, it's hard to be surprised by any of this. But for Peter and the disciples and for those people hearing the gospel for the first time, this is a shock. The Son of Man, this promised Messiah, this promised conqueror, must suffer. And never before this moment had anyone in Israel connected suffering with the Messiah. Now, there were many prophecies about a servant of the Lord who suffers, like in Isaiah chapter 43 and 44 and 53. He was wounded for our transgressions, bruised for our iniquities. The chastisement of our peace was upon him. By his stripes we are healed. He was despised and rejected. All of those verses, Isaiah 43, 44, and 53. But nobody before Jesus had ever associated those texts with the hope of the Messiah, who was supposed to defeat evil and injustice and make everything right in the world and not die at the hands of evil. Now, a common question I often get, so I'll ask it since you're not here to ask it, is, well, what do the Jewish people think about Jesus today? Don't they recognize that he's the Messiah because he fulfilled all of these Isaiah things of the suffering servant, that he was despised, rejected, a man of sorrows, acquainted with griefs? Don't they understand that that's the Messiah? Well, for many Jewish people today, do you know who this suffering servant of the Lord is? The Jewish people themselves. And there's no question that throughout the centuries they have been despised, rejected, people of sorrows, people who had been persecuted, horribly treated, and of course, we say most notably in the time of the Holocaust, but the Holocaust is a repetition of a long-standing tradition in the world. Who is the suffering servant? The Jewish people are the suffering servant, is the answer that you'll get from rabbis today. Still, they're expecting a very different Messiah than Jesus, even as the disciples were expecting a very different Messiah from Jesus. But Jesus says the Son of Man must suffer. Now, I'm going to quote somebody that I often do, Timothy Keller, because he makes this excellent point. By using the word must, when Jesus says this Messiah must suffer, Jesus is also indicating that he's planning to die. He's doing it voluntarily. He's not merely predicting it'll happen. It's one thing for Jesus to say, okay, I'll fight, I'll be defeated. Or eventually I'm going to push the Pharisees and the temple officials so far that they'll have no alternative and I just know what's going to happen. They're just going to kill me. But no, he says, this is why I came. I intend to die. That's how I'm going to defeat evil and put everything right. It must happen this way. And that's totally inexplicable to Peter, as it's totally inexplicable to many people today who regard Jesus as a prophet who eventually, unfortunately, got mixed up with the wrong crowd, offended the wrong people, and ended up between the gears of Roman justice. But no, Jesus says it has to happen this way. He didn't just say that the Son of Man would suffer, he said that the Son of Man must suffer. And the word is so crucial it's employed twice. The Son of Man must suffer many things, and he must be killed. The word must modifies and controls the whole sentence. That means everything in the list is a necessity. Jesus must suffer, must be rejected, must be killed, must be resurrected. So what Jesus said was not just, I've come to die, but he says, I have to die. It's absolutely necessary that I die. The world can't be renewed, and nor can your life unless I die. And the next thing he does in the passage is ask us to follow in those very footsteps, to take up our cross and to follow him. So no wonder Peter is confused and upset. You're the Messiah. And now the gospel turns into explaining in word and in deed just what that means. But it's not the Messiah Peter was expecting, and it's not the Messiah that he had chosen to follow. If you ever wondered why Peter denied Jesus 3 times when Jesus had been arrested and was facing crucifixion, he was still wrestling with this understanding. How can this guy be who I know him to be? Any more questions? There are no more questions. This is an important chapter. This is the fulcrum, the turning point in the Gospel of Mark. And from now, we're actually going to set our eyes towards Jerusalem. And the story of Jesus, chapter by chapter and step by step, is going to take us there. But first, maybe for Peter's sake as much as for ours, something amazing is going to happen. And we're going to read about that next week in Mark chapter 9. So, thank you for tuning in to this session. Now check our website and our Facebook to see if we will meet in person next time on February the 1st. If not, we'll always be here for you on video. Take care, and God bless you all.